Thank you very much for the opportunity to make a few remarks here this morning. The South African story, as President Mbeki aptly described it, is one of two realities. History afforded some privilege, and it burdened many more with poverty and strife. President Mbeki had used the analogy of the first and second economies to describe the challenge that we are facing in our country, arguing that the first economy produces the bulk of the country's wealth and is integrated with the global economy. And the second economy, or the marginalized economy, is characterized by underdevelopment. It contributes little to the GDP. It contains a big percentage of our population. It incorporates the poorest of our rural and urban poor. Is structurally disconnected from both the first and global economies, and is incapable of self-generated growth and development, quote unquote. This history that created this reality is not ambiguous or enigmatic. It was a history of entrenching the economic advantage of the minority, determined on the basis of their racial composition, and simplifying the role of Africans to be that of cheap labor. The divides of the past and our present economy have naturally manifested themselves across our political spectrum. While the ANC has embodied the struggles of the disenfranchised masses, other political parties have been the very representation of minority privilege and continue in their daily existence to seek to preserve those privileges. The ANC was founded and crafted on the dissension of Africans against their exclusion from the Union of South Africa. And that has defined what it became over the years and what it is to this present day, seeking a socially inclusive economy and a more inclusive society. Of course, clearly, the more things change, though, the more they remain the same in other aspects, in other respects. Just as the elections during apartheid struck the similar Swartgevaar chord, today some in the opposition similarly seek to remind their jittery constituency about the same, as if this is still reality. And so the illusion about a probable disintegration of the ANC, which obviously isn't about to happen anytime soon, and certainly not by 2019, in the last elections, the DA ran a campaign titled, in previous elections, they ran a campaign titled Stop Zuma, offering nothing more to their voters than another African to fear. I think the obsession with Zuma strikes this chord again and again. The only difference, obviously, is that this time around, the regurgitated scare story has had an aesthetic fortune of being carried by some of their other leaders. The elections that the ANC fought for have become to some amongst us an opportunity to recapitulate to old fears of fear, to old ideas of fear. And to drive this point, one only needs to factually track the DA leaders' praise of Presidents Mandela and Mbeki. An accurate assessment of this newfound affection for these two leaders would be that it may appear easier to praise them once they are no longer actively in power. So that whilst President Mbeki is hailed as a better leader today by the DA, not so long ago, he was described as a man who has failed to lead, responsible for genocide in the country and other issues. But of course, opportunism in politics is common. One can understand the difficulty of the DA in being deliberately blind to progress. After all, it would prove more difficult to sell a doomsday narrative whilst acknowledging that much has improved in our country. The funny thing is that Karl Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte had written about this, that history repeats itself, that events in history repeat themselves, the first time as a tragedy, the second time as a farce. So while the Nets were captivated by the tragedy of Swart Gevaar, today's manifestations of the same have become nothing more than just a farce. The ANC has at every elections stated its policies and gone into an election with a plan. So to generalize as if all of us are preoccupied with the Nkandla debates and other things is really unfortunate. The fact of the matter is that the DA is preoccupied with the Nkandla. The rest of us, or some of us, are talking about our policies and our plans and what we seek to do over the next 5 to 20 years. And that provides an opportunity to be brutally honest about assessing the progress achieved in the previous elections, about assessing the progress and the failures, and being honest about what was not achieved. It's a challenging responsibility for anybody to make admissions of wrongdoing at times, of failure at times, to acknowledge progress whilst ensuring that complacency doesn't weaken our urgency for change. It is in this context that the ANC has had to act as a stabilizing force, having to tread the complex line between maintaining property rights and facilitating a redistribution process, having to work within the market mechanism whilst establishing incentives to drive transformation, and ensuring that the state plays a critical role in the economy. Having to support private investment in a range of areas in the economy whilst employing state-owned companies to drive investment in strategic areas that could be compromised under private custodianship. And I will refer to these to some length a little bit later, before my 20 minutes is over. Most stakeholders would agree in principle that unless the racial ownership and management profile of the economy is transformed to reflect the composition of our society, it is unlikely that our political dispensation will be sustainable or will continue being legitimate. The fundamental question before the people of South Africa in these coming elections is not the realignment of politics or the disintegration of the ANC. That's peripheral. The fundamental issue, the critical question that these elections must answer is how do we radically and more meaningfully transform the South African economy? That's what these elections are about. Realignment of politics is coincidental if it will happen. It's been tried before, it didn't happen. It's been hoped for before, it didn't become reality. We have also used many levers at the state's disposal, such as the procurement spend, our ability to grant licenses or concessions, the further to accelerate the transformation process. While we have made some progress, we clearly need to find additional levers to accelerate the processes of change if our democratic dispensation is to retain its legitimacy as a means of economic emancipation. The following gives a sense of our achievements and the challenges that remain in this area. In 2000, if state ownership and foreign ownership of the JSE are excluded, 23% of individual ownership was in the hands of black South Africans against 77% owned by white South Africans. By 2010, this had gone up to 34% black ownership and 66% white ownership, according to economist.co.za. Ownership of shares in the JSE retirement funds have gone from 23% black and 77% white in 1995 to 37% black and 63% white in 2010. In 2000, black people made up just 6% of top management, and 13 years down the line, it's just 12%, with white South Africans still holding on to 73% of those roles. A tier down in senior management, black people are slightly better represented at 18%, but white South Africans still dominate disproportionately at 62%. In 2005, the average monthly earnings for white South Africans were more than 5 times the average of monthly earnings for black South Africans. In 2011, they earned 4 times more. Based on land reform data published by the government, the South African Institute of Race Relations has calculated that as much as 44% of privately owned land in South Africa, excluding land owned by the state, is in black hands. Now, we therefore must congratulate the DA at its last policy conference for at least acknowledging, after 20 years of democracy, that these racial disparities actually do exist as a result of our past. The recent release of the Goldman Sachs report provides insight into the extraordinary progress that the ANC government has achieved at an economic level since coming to power in 1994, despite the fact that we still have many challenges to overcome. The GDP has increased by 2.5 times, tax revenues have increased from 113.8 billion rand in 1994 to 813 billion rand in 2012. Employment increased from 9 million people to 13.2 million people. And so on and so on and so on, the good story goes on. The last 20 years has seen some significant changes in our economic policies, as we have undergone a steep learning curve around the difference between ineffectual policies that are based on ideological rhetoric and dogmatism, and pragmatic policies that are based on continuous bottom-up learning process about what works in practice. Probably our biggest policy mistake in the last 20 years was to buy into the neoliberal policy dogma that we should privatize our state-owned companies and leave the provision of strategic infrastructure in the private sector, to the private sector. What this dogma overlooked was that the private sector will only invest in an extremely sophisticated and stable policy and regulatory environment where a multitude of risks will be borne by the state, and the private sector can and will cherry-pick the value chain. I think all of the challenges, many of the challenges we are facing in regard to our infrastructure capacity at the present moment, especially with regard to the provision of mega, the delivery of mega projects, stem exactly from the mistakes such as these ones. The Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Commission was therefore established to close this gap and deal with the challenges of coordination, of integration, and above all else, establishing a long-term plan. It dovetails very well with the national planning, with the national development plan, and the work that the National Planning Commission has actually done to try and provide a long-term plan which will be good for investors, which will be good for the South African economy, and which will ensure that in terms of our planning for infrastructure capacity provision, we can have a long-term planning horizon, and therefore it will make success of the coordination and integration efforts. Key to all of this is that we must drive an industrialization program in order to be able sustainably to develop the South African economy, create sustainable and decent jobs, and lift South Africans from poverty inequality and unemployment to a position where they can live decent lives. The South African economy is facing in this regard the classical structural challenge of a middle-income economy. In order to grow and develop, we need to invest aggressively in new plant technologies and skills. We need to invest in new capacities and capabilities to secure the sustainability, to ensure that we build our capacity to design and manufacture intermediate and complex tradable goods and support the development of a small and medium manufacturing sector. So what is actually required in order to deal with this program for economic transformation is that we must continue to implement our infrastructure program and on the back of it to industrialize the South African economy, ensuring through our local procurement targets that we support the development of a small and medium enterprise sector. We need to support strategic sectors in the economy by providing them incentives to grow and create employment. We need to provide support to young people through the youth employment tax incentive as well as training and education. We need to implement radical land reform programs and ensure that in rural areas we create a dynamic economic activity that will reduce the urbanward migration, which tends to create a lot of pressure in the urban areas, particularly in cities like Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban. But obviously, we must not regard, because of the weaknesses of the past, which we must not be too harsh on, because we are only a 20-year-old democracy. We are transforming our society as we go and are learning from the process. We need to, therefore, be of the firm view that in the next 20 years, having achieved the political, what seemed to others as a political miracle in the last 20 years, we need to shift our attention more decisively towards economic transformation so that we are able to move our society forward. But linked with that is the responsibility to build the capacity of the state to address weaknesses in our state and governance systems to ensure that we have a well-competent cadre of public servants who are able to deliver the services and execute their responsibilities as required. And these are the challenges that are before South Africans. This election, therefore, in our view, is about development. And the next election will also be about development. We have set ourselves a 20-year trajectory to do something meaningful with the South African economy and ensure that we not only recover from the slump we suffered as a result of the global recession, but we are able to position our economy towards a higher growth level than we ever achieved in the past, so that we can create sustainable and decent employment for most South Africans. And finally, the election is not really about Zuma, as some would like us to believe. It's an election about a concerted effort to develop our society. And that is what should preoccupy the minds of South Africans. But we all understand that an election is an emotional period, a lot takes place, a lot of discussions take place. But when the dust settles, the elections having been run, the country will have to return to what are the essentials we must do in order to move South Africa forward. And that is to transform the South African economy and raise it to a new level of growth and development where we will achieve social inclusions for the majority of South Africans. And it's only on the basis of this meaningful transformation that we can achieve the objective of creating a non-racial society. moving away from a multiracial society where different South Africans just simply coexist, but towards a real meaningful non-racial society where, as President Oliver Tambo once said, there will neither be blacks nor whites, but South Africans united in their diversity. Thank you.
eNCA.com.